Hello, today we're going to talk about the Americans and their desire for independence. And looking at the colonies, they had been on their own for quite some time. There weren't really any issues with Great Britain for hundreds of years. And the British believed that the colonies simply existed in order to provide economic advantages for the mother country. In doing so, the colonies kind of did as they pleased. They did this because Great Britain was 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. News took about 2 months to reach the colonies. Governors and colonial legislatures were the ones that handled everyday problems. They essentially governed themselves. And two events are going to change the relationship Great Britain had with the colonies. One is the French and Indian War, and the second is the crowning of King George III. So, in looking at the French and Indian War, Britain felt that the colonists needed to pay for the war because Great Britain protected the colonies, and then they maintained an army after the war in case of any Indian rebellions. And looking at the crowning of King George III, he was crowned in 1760. After he was crowned, he instituted a number of taxes on the colonies, taxes on goods like sugar, tea, glass, paper, and other products. The Stamp Act of 1765 was really the first direct tax on the colonies. It was a tax on legal documents, pamphlets, newspapers, dice, playing cards, marriage certificates, things like that. And then King George III also passed laws that regulated colonial trade. This benefited Great Britain, however, it hurt the economy of the colonies. The goal of these taxes was for Great Britain to raise revenue because they needed to pay for the French and Indian War, the war that they just fought, quote unquote, for the colonies. So, as these taxes are instituted, resentment in the colony is going to grow. Colonists are going to start protesting. They're eventually going to boycott British goods. And as a result, the Stamp Act will be repealed, but other acts are going to take its place, including the Townshend Acts. In response to that, the United States is going to, or not the United States, the colonies are going to have the Boston Tea Party in 1773. It is here where they dump all of the tea into the Boston Harbor. In response, Parliament is going to pass the Coercive Acts, or known as the Intolerable Acts to the colonists, where they close the port of Boston and essentially stop Massachusetts from governing itself. And these intolerable acts are going to spark a sense of unity within the colonies. Until then, the colonists all thought of themselves as being British subjects and citizens of their states. They were Virginians, they were Georgians, they were South Carolinians. And this really kind of shifted gears and made them feel united. Colonial leaders began working together to really stop these acts of British oppression. So, in 1765, and I know this is kind of taking a step back, but 9 colonies are going to send delegates to the Stamp Act Congress to organize and protest the Stamp Act. And this was before it was repealed. And they wrote a petition to King George III asserting that the colonial legislatures were the only ones that could impose direct taxes on the colonies. And then 1773, the colonists are completely against British rule. And they start organizing committees of correspondence to maintain communication lines between the various colonies. To give you an idea of how many there were 80 of these committees in Massachusetts alone. Then on September 5th, 1774, you're going to have the First Continental Congress, where the colonies wanted to decide what to do with their relationship with King George III. They decided to place an embargo against Great Britain and boycott British goods, meaning they decided to prevent trade with Great Britain and then prevented buying their goods. They proposed a second meeting if things did not change after a year. The British took the exact opposite measure of what the colonies wanted. They took a stronger stance, and the king actually declared the New England colonies an open rebellion. So, a year later, they meet and have the Second Continental Congress, and this is where things are going to, I guess, get violent. You have Lexington and Concord, which is where the first shots were fired. As a result of that, the colonies are going to meet 3 weeks later in Philadelphia, and this is where we get the Second Continental Congress. The Congress took the role as the central government. John Hancock was elected as the president of the Congress. He was wealthy. He had the ability to raise money. Congress organized an army and navy. They appointed George Washington, the commander of the army, and then they acted as the government throughout the American Revolution. As violence was continuing to grow, there was a desire for independence. And Thomas Paine, he's an interesting character. He's actually from Great Britain, and he was in the colonies for all of, I think, a couple of years before he wrote this pamphlet called Common Sense, which advocated for American independence. And his essential argument was that it was common sense that the colonies should be independent. Another figure is Samuel Adams, who influenced desire for independence in his various letters and essays to different people in the colonies. You had Richard Henry Lee, who introduced a resolution to Congress for independence in June of 1776. And when he did this, the committee was put in place to write the document. And Thomas Jefferson was chosen by the committee to write the declaration, and the final draft was approved on July 4th of 1776. So you can see I've got pictures here of Thomas Paine on the left, Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, and Thomas Jefferson, who all had influential roles in the colony's Declaration of Independence. And looking at the Declaration of itself, there are many key parts. They said that no government had been founded on the principles of popular sovereignty and the consent of the government, or on the consent of the governed. Jefferson drew on the ideas of the social contract theory, looked at Locke and the ideas of others like Montesquieu and Rousseau. And the Declaration also provided a list of reasons why the colonies were angry with Great Britain and why the American Revolution was justified. There are 4 specific parts. You have the preamble, which went through the source of the basic rights Americans have, as well as the rights that come from a higher power. The second part is a statement of purpose and where the human rights come from, or the fact that they come from nature. The third part is the specific things, the list of grievances against King George III. And the final part is the conclusion, which basically was the decision that the colonists had made to break away from Great Britain and King George III.